A racially motivated attack at Davis High School nearly 40 years ago. A 17-year-old Vietnamese boy loses his life, his family forever grieving. Tonight, the journey to create change under the harsh realities of racism.
We should not remain as a modern minority. We have to speak up and then work together.
And in celebration of Asian American Pacific Islanders, California's Chinese history and culture on display in the heart of Marysville at the Bok Kai Chinese Temple.
I mean, you're talking like 300 to 500 artifact pieces in there.
Building roots in California's farmland, a Japanese family's multi-generational journey working the land and building partnerships for peace and prosperity.
My generation's been able to reap the rewards of the hard working of the first generation.
Tonight in a KCRA3 Project Community Special, Asian in California. Good evening, welcome. I'm Golston Dark.
And I'm Stephanie Lynn. Tonight, Project Community Asian in California shines a light on the impact Asian Americans have had on the state's culture, economy, and diversity. Yeah, while the nation saw a surge in reported anti-Asian violence during the pandemic, acts of hate against the Asian community are not new. One such incident happened nearly 40 years ago in the city of Davis. Yeah, we start tonight by taking a look back in time at the killing of a local Vietnamese student and the conversation happening today to fight back against hate.
He was killed right outside of some classrooms.
If the hallways at Davis High School could talk.
I know that it was racially motivated.
Somebody got a knife out of their car. There were tensions between two groups.
They'd tell a story of a campus disrupted nearly 40 years ago.
At the high school today, the mood is one of shock
by a sudden act of violence.
There are a lot of white kids here that are prejudiced.
It happened on May 4th, 1983. Teacher Grace Kim was in her classroom.
Then suddenly, outside, I heard lots of noise and screaming.
Tensions between a small group of white students and a small group of Vietnamese students boiled over.
One of them was stabbed, somebody said. So I ran out.
Davis police discovered 17-year-old student Tong Hai Huen bleeding on the ground. He died 2 hours later at the hospital.
James Pierman faces felony murder charges. Many of Tong's
officers arrested then 16-year-old student James Pierman for using a knife to fatally stab Huen in the torso.
Just transferred to our high school from Long Beach. He bothered those three boys almost every day, calling name and threatening them.
A jury convicted Pierman of voluntary manslaughter, sentencing him to 6 years in juvenile prison. The verdict devastated Huen's family and left supporters shocked. Advocates said they'd expected a harsher punishment.
Really sad situation. They don't speak English well and no money.
Huen was survived by his mother, brother, and sister. Their family fled war in Vietnam just 3 years earlier, only to be met with tragedy in Davis.
Everybody's really sensitive about it now, so they'll, be extra nice to those kids.
But prejudice remained a constant fixture in the community. Before the trial, on the day of Huen's funeral, a group calling itself the White Student Union littered the Davis High School campus with racist leaflets, blaming immigrants for taking away jobs from white people. Davis High School's principal said the union had no ties to the school.
I think it's really alienating. Like, it makes you feel like you don't really, truly ever belong.
Fast forward 38 years later. We sat down with 3 current Davis High students on what it's like to be Asian American today.
Growing up, you face so many microaggressions. I've spent my entire life trying to convince my classmates I'm not going to eat their dogs, I'm not going to eat their scorpions. I've been told that I can't drive properly and I am meant to go back to my country, which I was born in America, so that really hurts being told that.
The girls told me they see Davis as a safe community, but they continue to feel the sting of racism.
With the recent Asian American hate crimes, it was kind of like a huge reminder for me that a lot of people in this country don't see you as American. I was born here, I think I'm very American, but there are people that just see you as a foreigner.
After Huen's death, the school started an initiative called Friendship Day. Students meet every week over various activities aimed at building empathy and inclusivity on campus. Riley and Sarah are members.
By really kind of getting to know one another, we learn that there's a lot more that unites us than separates us.
Kevin Williams is the advisor for Friendship Day. He also teaches history and race and social justice.
When immigrants come to our country, probably any country, there's always that period of they're not us. That's them, they're the others. Maybe the answer is not just teaching history and saying these are the mistakes we made, but also saying what could we have done differently, what power structures need to be in place to actually fix the problem.
We found Huen's photo in the Davis High yearbook. It is his only mention. There is nothing written on his death.
So this is not only the memorial site, but it's where it happened.
After the incident, the community built this memorial on campus at the site where Huen lost his life. While some flowers still grow, the planter is largely taken over by weeds.
You could look at that plaque and really honestly have no clue what happened.
There's always room for improvement.
The conversation over race and equity continuing today as Asian Americans find their voices.
We should not remain as a modern minority. We have to speak up and then work together.
To learn from the heartbreak of the past. And Tong Hai Huen would have turned 56 years old this year. In honor of his memory, the city of Davis in 1986 established an annual award in Huen's name, recognizing those demonstrating excellence in civil rights advocacy. Now, I did connect with Huen's family members, and while they declined to comment on camera, they did share a written statement reflecting on the events of what happened in 1983 and the impact Huen's death left behind. We've shared that statement online for you on our website, KCRA.com.
Well, after the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and America's entry into World War II, an estimated 120,000 Japanese Americans were sent to internment camps, about 3,500 from California's Central Coast. And they were surrounded by barbed wire and patrolled by armed guards. But the discrimination against Asian immigrants began long before the war. Aaron Clark has more on one prominent family's journey from Japan to the Salinas Valley and how they found opportunity despite all the setbacks.
For almost a century, the Tanamura family has worked the land here in California. From Watsonville to Castroville, Aromas to Salinas, the Tanamura family put down roots.
My generation's been able to reap the rewards of the hard working of the first generation.
The first Tanamuras arrived on American soil from Japan back in the 1800s. But it was the 5 brothers and 4 sisters of this generation, led by Big Brother George, that really forged a future in farming beginning in the 1920s.
At 15, he said that his dad had given the responsibility of their small farm to him at 15, so that's when he went to work.
But it wasn't easy. In 1913, California enacted the Alien Land Law, barring Asian immigrants from owning land, and then adding restrictions in the 1920s, barring American-born children of Asian immigrants from even leasing land.
My dad and his friends wanted to grow lettuce in Castroville because of the cool weather, and they had to get somebody to sign the lease paper to rent land.
So that's how they did it. They worked around the law, partnering with others when they had to. They weathered the hard years of the Depression and slowly built their farming business until World War II. 2 of the brothers were drafted and fought for this country. The rest of the family shipped off to an internment camp.
We were first put away here in the rodeo grounds. Maybe there was 3,500 people there. Stayed there about 3 months.
And then 3.5 years at a camp in Arizona. After the war, with no money and few options, the family came back to California, actually lived in this barn for a time.
It was a little tough to come back to Salinas, very heavily anti-Japanese feelings here in Salinas. So actually they settled in Gilroy. And in Gilroy, there was, 5 brothers and 4 sisters. So the 9 of us, went to go work in the fields.
And slowly, they worked their way back, eventually pooling their money to buy a 20-acre ranch in Aromas.
And always worked together. That was the great beauty of my family's history is that, the 5 brothers, they worked very successfully, hardworking, 6-7 days a week.
And they kept buying more land in the Salinas Valley, just a little bit at a time, and caught the attention of the Antle family.
My granddad was trimming lettuce in a packing shed, and saw the opportunity that, here's this wonderful group of Japanese growers that no one wants to do business with, and he was able to go out and befriend them and gain the trust. They were the best growers. They tended to their crops really well, and he knew how to put up a good pack, and it really served our family well.
It worked out well for both families. In the early 80s, they joined forces, forming what would become a produce powerhouse.
By that time, my family had 1,500 acres of ground that we had owned ourselves, And so she said, well, let's partner up. You had the land base, and I have the skills to sell it. So we decided to form, in 1982, Tatamuro Nanto. Even though some people were prejudiced, you have other people that, that treat the family very fairly. That's the great thing about America.
That was Aaron Clark reporting. And now to a room full of Chinese artifacts that could have been lost to time. But as Ty Steele shows us, the Marysville community banded together to help preserve the history of the Chinese community that helped build their state.
If you walk under the archways on 1st and D Streets in Marysville,
without that community's help, we would not be here.
You will be transported back in time.
It's a small museum, but there is just so much information packed in here. We tried very, very hard to get lots of great detail into every single artifact.
California's history is on display here, part of the Bakai Chinese Temple.
And then you have all of these photos of Mulong and all.
Heather Young and her family spearheaded the creation of this museum, which chronicles not just Chinese history and culture or creation of the railroads, but the creation of the state as we know it today.
A lot of times in history, in California's history, in the U.S. history, Chinese history is not spoken of that much. And so to have a place where people can come in and not only learn about a different culture than them, but also learn about their own state's history and America's history, because, we did play a part in it.
But the museum hasn't always looked like this. 5 years ago, KCRA3 met up with Young as she tried to preserve what was then an unknown stack of boxes in a room on the other side of the temple.
They had artifacts in them. Just how much, I had no idea. I mean, you're talking like 300 to 500 artifact pieces in there. And, to catalog all of that was just such a huge undertaking.
These are the paper mache puppets that we have. We're still trying to figure out exactly what this is.
Figuring out what this and scores of other materials were happened with the help of San Jose State University, who got a grant to catalog all the materials in the temple. But what was supposed to be a one-year project turned into 3.
It was, labor of loves from 2 different interns, and they did a fantastic job, because without that, oh my gosh, that was the foundation of everything that we went off of to pull artifacts to figure out what we would display in here.
Even after that, preserving and displaying the artifacts required money. So Young took a modern sensibility to their historical museum. She turned to Kickstarter. They asked for $10,000. The Marysville community got them that and more.
I had no clue that it was gonna, skyrocket like it did. But I'm obviously so grateful. And then we had private donations, and then we already had a $50,000 grant. So we reached pretty close to $100,000 with the help of everybody to even get this project off its feet.
And just before the COVID-19 pandemic hit in 2020, the museum had its grand opening. The museum's centerpiece, Mulong, a restored Chinese dragon.
Mulong's always going to be a huge favorite. We believe it's one of the first dragons to ever come here from China.
But it's the little things that Young really loves, the human touches.
There is a passport over here, too, of a gentleman from back in the 1800s that, I guess, to me, I'm like, that's a person's story. There's a picture of him there. So it always makes me wonder, what his family, is doing now, and what brought him here to the States.
And in a time where the U.S. is seeing more hatred aimed at Asian and Pacific Islanders, Young and the members of the Marysville Temple see their little corner of First Street as a connection to their community.
One of the great things about Marysville is that people really do open up to some new cultural experiences and getting to know something that may be different than them.
In Marysville, Ty Steele, KCRA 3 News.
Some real treasures there. Well, the temple and the museum are also in charge of the Bokai Parade every year for Chinese New Year, which they did as a drive-through last year. The museum and temple are back open now with an appointment. Coming up, time travel with us to the early 1850s when Chinese fishermen helped make Monterey one of the most successful fishing ports in California.
They were the first, and they had fishing villages in Carmel Bay, Point Lobos, Point Alones, and they were the first to really see the value of commercial fishing.
Welcome back. The oldest established Chinatown in North America is in San Francisco. It is currently the largest Chinatown outside of China.
Yeah, but in the late 1800s, Monterey's Chinatown was the largest in the state. It was down near Cannery Row. And Lauren Seaver has a look at the history of Chinese immigration on the Monterey Peninsula.
This is Jerry Losabito, a fifth-generation Monterey Peninsula local, but says for most of her life she didn't know about her ancestors until a trip to Point Lobos State Natural Reserve in the 1990s.
We told my mom that, hey, we saw a picture in the cabin of a lady who, it looks like she's standing in front of Grandma's house.
It turns out it is her grandma's house, still standing today just off of the Monterey Peninsula Rec Trail, a block up from Cannery Row. And the woman in the picture, her great-grandmother.
So they arrived at the mouth of the Carmel River in 1851, and then they settled here in Point Lobos and built the village here. Quoc Moi was born here in Point Lobos in 1859, and she is the first documented Chinese female born in the Monterey area.
She spoke 5 languages and became known as Spanish Mary because she would translate documents in different languages for various communities. After discovering this remarkable family history, Losabito shifted her focus to her great-grandfather.
He worked on the railroad that came into Monterey and ended, the line ended in Pacific Grove. Now what do? So he became a fisherman.
Huang Nguyen is an Asian American Studies professor at Cal State Monterey Bay. He says the Chinese started the state's commercial fishing industry on the Monterey Peninsula, exporting millions of pounds of abalone, shrimp, and squid.
They were the first, and they had fishing villages in Carmel Bay, Point Lobos, Point Alones, and they were the first to really see the value of commercial fishing.
And with success came struggle and discrimination. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, blocking immigration from China. Several local ordinances were also passed.
To ban the drying of squid, the banning of abalone. There were also ordinances that were passed that were colorblind at their face, but were very specifically targeted at Chinese and other Asians.
And then in May of 1906, a suspicious fire tore through Losabito's great-grandfather's community in Point Alones, destroying almost all of the homes in what was the largest Chinese fishing village on the West Coast. As a result, Professor Nguyen says those living there were forced to move elsewhere. But Losabito's family stayed on the Monterey Peninsula.
They still continued on. They made laws that prevented them from fishing the way they had. Well, they fished at night. So every time there was an obstacle thrown in their way, they figured out a way to continue to survive.
Losabito says she's inspired by her ancestors' perseverance despite injustice, and she's determined to keep their legacy alive.
People have tried to exclude us all along the way, that their story still lives on. And I'm going to make sure it lives on, too.
Lauren Seaver, KCRA 3 News.
All right. Well, what an amazing family story that she was able to find her great-grandmother. Next, preserving the history of immigrants. Their stories shared in books for all ages. Preserving the history of immigrants. Their stories shared in books for all ages.
We're as American as we could be, obviously, but we don't want our kids to lose their heritage and culture.
Sometimes she does.
Coming up, celebrating Asian American, Pacific Islander history and heritage through literature. Well, welcome back. Asian Americans saw the fastest population growth rate in the last decade.
Yeah, and as the country continues to become more multicultural, there's growing interest in children's books celebrating diversity. I found out how this trend is shaping reading habits for local children.
Amy's mom and dad make perfect bow.
If there's one thing the Nakanishi kids like to do, it's read.
Amy can do a lot of things.
Just ask 9-year-old Malia how many books she's finished.
I don't know.
A fair answer, because she's read so many.
I have a lot of favorite different books.
Walking us through some of her personal favorites, like Kelly Yang's Front Desk.
I meet a lot of new characters.
A story of an Asian girl just about Malia's age, working with her immigrant parents to manage a hotel in California.
And it just gives me a feeling of what it's like, people of color.
With them, we've really focused on having an inclusive bookshelf.
Parents Emily and Leo making it a priority to expose the kids to characters and storylines reflecting the diversity of the world today. And
we're as American as we could be, obviously, but we don't want our kids to lose their heritage and culture.
Sometimes she does.
So having these kind of books that allow us to, emphasize who we are, I think has been very, very great.
These are her favorites.
In Lodi, 3-year-old Emily Del Carlo getting exposed to books early about her Asian heritage. A family favorite,
Dim Sum for Everyone.
Written by Grace Lin. The book teaches kids about Asian food.
You like that too? You like tofu? I just want her to learn about her culture, different cultures, and I want her to be proud.
Mom Linda is Cambodian American. Dad Michael is Italian American.
I want her to be able to go through life and to learn that everybody is different, and that's okay, and that's what makes this country great.
About 25% of books published for kids by American companies in 2019 featured characters of color. That's according to a survey by the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
It's been a big shift.
Award-winning author Grace Lin telling us she's hopeful the situation could change as more publishers recognize the demand for books with diverse characters.
If kids are inundated with stories where the heroes are never diverse, then they can never picture a person of color being a hero.
Why was it so important for you as an author to write about characters with Asian American backgrounds?
Our world is diverse every day, and so we should make our reading diverse every day as well.
In 2019, for the first time, more than half of the nation's population under the age of 16 identified as an ethnic minority, according to the Brookings Institution. And in the last decade, Asian Americans recorded the fastest population growth rate among all racial groups, growing 81%.
To live in this country today, understanding diversity, I think, is just extremely important.
That really helps to teach kids acceptance. The United States is awesome. We're just so diverse that we should have books that reflect, who we're surrounded by.
Kids learning how to write the next chapter on empathy and inclusivity by picking up a book.
The end.
Such cute kids.
Yeah.
Love that. Well, the Asian population in the U.S. grew from roughly 10 million people to nearly 19 million people in the last decade.
Well, we want to thank you for joining us tonight for our project Community Asian in California. Have a good rest of your night. Good night.